We're going to be in Ecclesiastes chapter 12 this morning. Ecclesiastes chapter 12. When we looked at this last week and talked about Solomon telling us everything in this world is vanity, it just kind of kept rolling around in my head. And Dave was right, as you read through Ecclesiastes, Solomon gives us a lot of good information and a lot of things that we need to do. And he tells us here in this 12th chapter the important things of life as we look at it. When we begin thinking about Ecclesiastes here, what Solomon says about life, he does tell us that everything is vanity. That it's all kind of useless, that it's all going to pass away, that it really has not a whole lot of meaning as far as the things that we strive to do and things of that nature. He even goes as far in chapter 11 to tell us there in verse 9, he says, "Rejoice, O young man, in thy youth, and let thy heart cheer thee in the days of thy youth, and walk in the ways of thine heart, and in the sight of thine eyes. But know thou that for all these things God will bring thee into judgment." So he tells us there, even in chapter 11, he says, go and walk, do whatever you desire. Go and do the things that you desire. And that's exactly what Solomon done. He had tried this approach in his life. He had done the things that he desired. He could go anywhere that he wanted. He did those things. He sought pleasure. He amassed fortunes. He threw himself into work. Last week we talked about him searching for knowledge, and he talks about the things that he has acquired through his hands and things of that nature. And he gives us an idea of all the things that he tried there in Ecclesiastes chapter 2. Beginning in verse 3, it says, "I sought in mine heart to give myself unto wine, yet acquainted mine heart with wisdom, and to lay hold on folly, till I might see what was that good for the sons of men, which they should do under the heaven all the days of their life. I made me great works. I builded me houses. I planted me vineyards. I made me gardens and orchards. I planted trees in them and all kinds of fruits. I made me pools of water to water therewith the wood that bringeth forth trees. I got me servants and maidens, and I had servants born in my house. Also I had great possessions of great and small cattle, above all that were in Jerusalem before me. I gathered me also silver and gold, and the peculiar treasure of kings and of the provinces and of provinces. I gat me men singers and women singers, and the delights of the sons of men, as musical instruments and that of all sorts. So I was great and increased more than all that were before me in Jerusalem. Also my wisdom remained with me, and whatsoever mine eye desired I kept not from them. I withheld not my heart from any joy, for my heart rejoiced in all my labor, and this was my portion of all my labor. Then I looked on all the works that my hands had wrought, and on the labor that I had labored to do, and behold, all was vanity and vexation of spirit, and there was no profit under the sun. You skip down to verse 17, it says, "Therefore I hated life, because the work that is wrought under the sun is grievous unto me, for all is vanity and vexation of spirit." So he tells us that he tried everything that there was in this world. Solomon had the abilities, he had the knowledge, he had anything that he desired there, and he tried all those things. He did everything that he desired. And in this world that we live, a lot of people try to do the same thing, don't they? A lot of people try to live in that same manner in today's time. They'll throw themselves into things of this world. They'll try to find happiness and pleasure and wealth or wisdom. They'll throw themselves into work. They'll spend all their waking hours there. They'll throw themselves into sports or physical fitness, clothing, style. They throw themselves into all kinds of things trying to find that happiness and trying to find those pleasures that they think this world holds. But Solomon tells me this world doesn't hold those pleasures. You know, we go back to what we talked about last week. He told us that this world doesn't hold that it's only in God that we find that pleasure. Only in God that we find those things. But still yet, a lot of people try to do that, don't they? A lot of people try to seek that. A lot of people try to find those things in the world that we live, and yet it's all vanity. It's an emptiness, a pocket full of nothing, is what Solomon tells us here. But we get into chapter 12 here, and he begins to give us some instruction on the things that we should do. In verse 1, he says, "Remember now thy Creator in the days of thy youth, while the evil days come not, nor the years draw nigh, when thou shalt say, I have no pleasure in them. While the sun or the light or the moon or the stars be not darkened, nor the clouds return after the rain, in the day when the keepers of the house shall tremble, and the strong men shall bow themselves, and the grinders cease because they are few, and those that look out of the window be darkened, and the doors shall be shut in the streets, and the sound of the grinding is low, and he shall rise up at the voice of the bird, and all the daughters of music shall be brought low. And when they shall be afraid of that which is high, and fear shall be in the way, and the almond tree shall flourish, and desire shall fail, because man goeth to his long home, and the mourners go about the streets. Or ever the silver cord be loosened, or the golden bowl be broken, or the pitcher be broken at the fountain, or the wheel broken at the cistern, then shall the dust return to the earth as it was, and the spirit shall return unto God who gave it. Vanity of vanities, saith the preacher, all is vanities." I'm going to continue on here in just a minute, but I'm going to stop there and talk about this. Here in verse 8, he tells us all is vanity. And he tells us why. He says we look at some of these things, but we need to remember our Creator in the days of our youth. And he goes on here and tells us that one of these days we're going to pass away. One of these days, the things that we know, the things that we have, the things that we see, they're going to pass off this scene. So we need to remember our Creator in the days of our youth. You know, a lot of times we think, well, I want to sow my wild oats, and I want to put off becoming a Christian, or I want to put off going to church, or whatever it may be for a while. You know, I want to sow those wild oats. You hear that a lot in this world. People have that mindset. But the thing is, we have no guarantee we'll ever come back, do we? We have no guarantee that we'll ever have a desire in our hearts to come back. We have no guarantee that we will even remember to come back. I'm afraid the older I get, the less memory I have. You know, just to be honest with you, I have to write things down, and I know a lot of you all are the same way. We have to write things down, and we'll be at home, and Kay will come through the house, and the minute she'll come back, and she says, "What'd I go in there for?" You know, and I'm kind of the same way. I'll walk into a room, and I think, now I wanted something. You know, what is it that I wanted? What is it that I was looking for? What was on my mind at that point in time? We may just forget. You know, we may get to the point where we just don't remember those things. And it's sad to say that happens. You know, I saw Kay's grandmother do that. She regressed in her mind to where she didn't know anybody, and even went back to where she kind of acted like a small child. You know, had a little baby doll, and that was her whole world. She loved that little baby doll, and she played with it, and petted it, and things of that nature. But as far as the things that had been on her mind for all those years, they wasn't there anymore. The blessing was that she had been a Christian lady for all of her life, you know, and then this happened to her and pulled her mind away. But we don't have that promise, do we, that we'll even remember. And then we don't have the promise that we'll have a tomorrow to do this. You know, the Bible tells us that our life is a vapor, that we're here today and gone tomorrow. We have no guarantee that we'll make it home today. We have no guarantee we'll make it through this service. You know, there's absolutely no guarantee in those things. So I have no guarantee that I can sow my wild oats today and then tomorrow decide to live for God, or tomorrow decide to change the way that I'm living or the things that I'm doing. I don't have that guarantee. Solomon even tells us that in Ecclesiastes 3:2. He says, there's a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant, a time to pluck up. That's what's planted. You know, there's a time for everything. The problem is we don't know that time. God didn't, when we were born, God didn't reach down and put a time stamp on that birth certificate and say, okay, this one's going to live till they're 105, or this one's going to live till they're 5, or this one's going to live 5 minutes. You know, He didn't do that for us. If He had of, we'd probably all be worried to death anyway, wouldn't we, about what that said. We have no knowledge of when those things are. So if we start when we're young, then when we get to that point when we're older, there should be no regrets, right? When we get to that point, if we give our heart and life to God at our later years, which I've seen people do, I've seen people give their heart to God on their deathbed. You know, they'd be laying there and know they're dying and ask God into their life. And I wondered in my mind, if in their mind after they felt what God done in their lives, if they said, man, I wish I'd have just done that years ago, and then I could have been an example. I could have worked for God. I could have done the things that God desired in my life. I wondered if that went through their mind. But you know, there will be no regrets if we start when we're young. There's no time wasted, and we can do the things that God desires us to do. You know, I love it when I hear somebody stand up and give a testimony. I was saved at a young age, and I've lived my life for God. I've done the things that I needed to do. I love that testimony. I don't have that testimony. My parents took me to church. You know, I was in church. I knew what church was about, and yet I didn't really give my life to God. I didn't begin to do the things that God wanted me to do until I was about 30 years old. You know, I had 15 years or longer. I had more than that, really. I had 30 years. But I had 15 or 20 years of influence on friends in school and things of that nature, that I could have been a different influence for all those that were around me. But yet I wasted that. Now, I work with a guy now that I went to school with. He's a year behind me, but I went to school with him. And he'll say, do you remember so-and-so? Now, I already told you my memory's not that great anyway, but no, I don't remember them. And then he'll say, yeah, they were this or they were that, or you ought to know them. And I'll say, I wasn't near as friendly as I ought to have been back then. I wasn't near the person I should have been, you know, back when I was in high school. There's regrets there. You know, even though I didn't wait till I was 80 years old, those years that I missed, there's regrets. I had an opportunity, and I passed up that opportunity to chase after some of the same things here that Solomon chased after in his life. And there's a regret there. And I believe that's what we're seeing in Solomon. He's looking at his life, and he's seeing all these things that he chased after, and he's got a little bit of regret. He's got a little bit of regret in his life that he spent his time and his efforts and his monies and things of that nature chasing after those things that he thought would bring him happiness. And now he's just a little bit of regret as he looks back on his life and says, man, if I had only, I think what's going through his mind, if I had only. So he tells us there, remember the Creator in the days of thy youth. Remember those things. And there in verse 8 he says, because it's all vanity. You ain't got the Creator in your life, it's all vanity. And then verse 9 he says, and moreover, because the preacher was wise, he still taught the people knowledge. Yea, he gave good heed and sought out and set in order many proverbs. The preacher sought to find out acceptable words, and that which was written was upright, even words of truth. The words of the wise are as goads, and as nails fastened by the masters of assemblies, which are given from one shepherd. And further, by these, my son, be admonished, of making many books there is no end, and much study is the weariness of the flesh. Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God and keep His commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. I'm going to stop there again and not read that last verse, but he tells us there, the first thing he gives us at the very first verse in that chapter, he says, remember your Creator. And then he tells us all these other things that are going to come about, all these other things that are vanity, all these other things that are going to happen. And then here in this verse, he says, let us hear the conclusion. The whole matter. The only thing that matters. This is the whole matter. Fear God. Fear God. Remember the Creator and fear God. Not in a sense of dread. Not in a sense as, oh no, there's a God out there and He's wanting to stick His thumb on top of me and just mash me into the ground. You know, it's not that kind of dread. Not a dread that we would have if we were afraid that He was going to destroy us. But we need to fear God in a manner of giving Him respect and giving Him I can't think of the word I'm looking for. Give Him respect and give Him the admiration of our lives that is doing is what we need to do. We need to come to Him and be in awe of those things. In chapter 6 of Isaiah, Isaiah is standing in the temple and God appears to him there. It tells him that God's sitting on the throne. His train fills the temple and He has 2 cherubs on each side, and those cherubs are sitting there in that temple and they're going, holy, holy, holy is our God. And as they're saying those things, that temple is vibrating. That temple is quivering from their praise toward God. And Isaiah is standing there. In my mind, I see him standing there before God, and I believe he's kind of like his. Because he realized exactly who he was. Realized exactly where he was at. I believe at that moment in time he had great fear in his life. Not that God was going to reach off that throne and squash him like an ant. I don't think that was the fear he had. I believe he had great fear in his life because he knew the admiration that God deserved. He knew that he needed to give God every ounce of his energy and being. And his response to God was, "Oh me, I am a man of unclean lips, and I live in a nation of unclean lips." He realized just exactly who he was at that point in time. He realized just how unworthy he was to be in the presence of God. I think sometimes we don't think about that. I think sometimes we don't think about giving God our all, giving God everything that we need to. Because if we don't know God, then one of these days there's going to be a dreadful meeting. But if we know God, then we ought to not have that dread, but that awe and wonder that Isaiah had. He goes on in that same verse and he says, "Fear God and keep His commandments, for that's the whole duty of man." So he tells us here, remember the Creator in the days of thy youth, fear Him all your life. Remember Him in awe, give Him the respect and admiration that He deserves in your life. Live for Him, not that you're afraid He's going to crush you, but that you're afraid that you're going to disappoint Him, is what He's telling us here. You know, I've looked in my Father's eyes before, and I've seen that look of disappointment, and that's worse than any whipping I ever got. I'll tell you that right now. When He looked at me with those eyes of disappointment, He didn't have to pull his belt off. I didn't have to hear that thing go click, 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 click through those belt loops. I'd already been beat to the core. I'd already been whipped worse than I ever had before. Because I disappointed Him. You know, I don't want to look at my Savior. I don't want to look at my God and see that same disappointment in His eyes when He looks at me and says to Him to say, "Hey, you could have done such a much better job. Or you could have lived this type of life. Or you could have done those things." Or, I don't want to see that disappointment in His life. I want to live my life as if I will never disappoint Him. Now, do I disappoint Him? I'm sure I do. I fail. I'm human. I fail. I'm just like Isaiah. When I think about where I am and who God is, I have no reason to think that God wants me. But yet He loves me. Just as He did Isaiah. He loves me. He had a task for us. Just as He does Isaiah. You know, He calls Isaiah there and He calls him to go out into his nation. He has a task for us. He's telling us, hey, we're not worthy. We know that. But yet He tells us. Go tell them. Go teach them. Go bring them. That's what He tells us to do, isn't it? We need to have that awe. Then he tells us to keep those commandments. One of the commentators I looked at said that there was 613 commandments in the first 5 books of the Bible. That doesn't go on in the rest of the Old Testament or the New Testament. 613 commandments. You reckon you can keep all 613? Now, a lot of these were directed toward the nation of Israel. You know, the things that they were told to do as far as setting up the tabernacle and giving the feasts and the sacrifices and things of this nature. A lot of them were pointed toward them. A lot of them were for them. But yet there's a lot of commandments in the Bible that are for us. Can we keep those? I'll tell you, I just can't. There's no way. I'm not capable. It's not possible. I'm a sinner. I'm a sinful human. And I'll never be perfect enough to keep God's commandments. So, how do we do this? You know, we can't accomplish it on our own. How do we do this? In Romans chapter 3, beginning in verse 21, it says, "But now the righteousness of God without the law was manifested, being witnessed by the law and the prophets, even the righteousness of God, which is by faith of Jesus Christ, and upon all them that believe. For there is no difference. For all have sinned and come short of the glory of God." We hear that verse all the time, don't we? All have sinned and come short of the glory of God. But being justified freely by His grace through the redemption that is in Christ Jesus, whom God has set forth to be a propitiation through faith in His blood, to declare His righteousness for the remission of sins that are past, through the forbearance of God. So there's no way that we can keep His commandments. There's no way that we'll ever be perfect. And that's what we'd have to be to keep those commandments. But there in Romans it tells us, you know, we're all sinners, but God. And I like it when we see those things. But God, or but the righteousness of God, or things like that. I like to see that in God's Word because it means He's done something. He's made a way for me. Here He made a way. He says, being justified freely by grace through His redemption. The Bible tells us by grace through faith, and that's exactly what this is talking about. God's grace was shed upon us as Christ shed His blood on the cross. As He hung on that cross and shed His blood to cover the sins of this whole world. He became our propitiation. That means He became our salvation. He became our price. He paid the debt we couldn't pay. He paid what we would never be able to do. So we need to fear God and keep His commandments. Tells us there, keep His commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. Now this is what we were made for. We were made to live for God. We were made to serve God. We were made to spread His gospel or to shine His light into this world. And that's the only thing that can fill us. That's the only thing that makes us whole. That's the only thing that can solve all these things that Solomon was looking for. It fills all those little crevices and holes. It makes us complete. It makes us whole. Only through God. So we need to accept our responsibility. The reason we need to do that is verse 14. He says, Solomon tells us, he says, "For God shall bring every work into judgment, with every secret thing, whether it be good or whether it be evil." He tells us we need to accept that responsibility because one of these days, God's going to look at our lives. In Romans chapter 2, verse 16, he says, "In the day when God shall judge the secrets of men by Jesus Christ according to my gospel." In chapter 14 of Romans, verse 10, it says, "But why dost thou judge thy brother? Or why dost thou set at naught thy brother? For we shall all stand before the judgment seat of Christ. For it is written, As I live, saith the Lord, every knee shall bow to me, and every tongue shall confess to God. So then every one of us shall give account of himself to God. In Hebrews 9:27 it says, And as it is appointed unto men once to die, but after this, the judgment. So Solomon tells us here that we'll be accountable for all those things. Everything that we've done will be brought into a judgment. So if we're going to be responsible, we need to serve God with all that we have, don't we? We need to serve God with our hands and our feet and our voice and our wealth and our mind and our motives and our heart and our love. We need to serve Him with everything that we have. That's the only way that we can ever get to the point when we're living the way God desires in our life. We need to serve Him with all we've got. Because, as Solomon said here, everything, every secret thing, whether it be good or whether it be bad, whether it be evil, will be brought into judgment. Solomon here tells us what's worthwhile. In Ecclesiastes chapter 2, let me flip over to that right quick. Ecclesiastes chapter 2, in verse 3, he says, I sought in my heart to give myself unto wine, yet acquainting my heart with wisdom, and to lay hold of folly, till I might see what was that good for the sons of men, which they should do under the heaven all the days of their life. In verse, I lost it there, but in the verse on down, he says it was vexation and vanity. Vexation of spirit. There's no, verse 11, he says, all was vanity and vexation of spirit. There was no profit under the sun. All those things were like empty pot. Like an empty pot. Solomon here, as he comes to us, he comes at the beginning of the book here, and he tells us, hey, everything's vanity unless it's God. Unless you have God, it's vanity. And then he tells us at the end of the book, the whole purpose of our life, the very purpose, the very existence that we have is for one purpose, one duty. He says, remember the Creator in thy youth. That's our whole purpose. Remember the Creator in our youth. Fear God. Keep His commandments. That's our whole duty as man. To remember Him, to fear Him, and to keep His commandments. Are we doing that in our life? Are we doing those things? If God looks into our lives, the Bible tells us here that everything's going to be brought out. When God looks into our lives, is He going to look and He's going to say, hey, you done everything that was asked of you. To remember me, to fear me, to keep my commandments, to do the things that I asked of you. Is that what we're going to see or what we're going to hear? Or are we going to hear something much worse? Something much worse. Matthew chapter 7, it tells us that God will look upon some and He'll say, depart from me, you workers of iniquity. God, I never knew you. I never knew you. Depart from me. Where will we stand when that time comes? Where will we stand? In my studies or in the things that I was reading over and things like that, there was one that I looked at, and it was, I think it was from the Naval Academy. I believe one of the chaplains had done a message or done a commencement service or something for them. And he used a little story at the end of it, and I thought about printing it off and bringing it, and I thought, no, I'm not going to use that. But for some reason, I feel like I ought to use it. But anyway, it was during, I believe that the date on it was 1780, during the Revolutionary War. And it was Connecticut town council or city council or whatever had met together. But that night there was an eerie fog had gathered. There was just an eerie atmosphere, I guess is what I'm looking for. And they thought maybe that it was because of some of the forest fires that was going on and things from, I guess, the combat and things, some of the forest fires, and maybe the fog mixed together. And a lot of people got to thinking that the judgment was coming. It's coming tonight. It's coming now. So during this town council, as they met, they were there meeting, and a lot of those people wanted to adjourn. They wanted to go home. They wanted to get a place where they felt like was safe. One of the folks there, and I wish now I'd have printed it off because it had his name, but one of the folks, as he was there in that council, he said, "No, I don't want to adjourn. I want you to bring candles." He said, because if judgment is coming, that's okay. If not, we need to be here about our business, right? And if it is coming, I want to be found doing my business. I want to be found doing the things that I need to be doing. And I guess that got me thinking. As we know the things that Solomon tells us here that we should do, to remember, to fear, to keep God's commandments, to live the life that He desires, are we doing our duty? Are we living those lives? Are we living the way that God desires? I certainly hope so. But if not, then that's exactly what He desires of us, isn't it? And He's sitting there with His arms wide open, saying, "Come to me." You would stand.
Page 596.